They gave me 72 hours to destroy my own house with a smile. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the cedar cabin I had built with my own hands, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise, when a young woman in a neat black coat walked into my backyard with the measured step of someone on official business. Little did I know that in exactly 72 hours, this same woman would be begging me not to foreclose on her house. And you know what they say about people who like to abuse their power? They're often the easiest to overthrow. Comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I'm curious if anyone else has had to deal with these self-proclaimed neighborhood dictators. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a 34-year-old software engineer who moved to Millbrook Heights, Colorado about 2 years ago. The cabin she was approaching wasn't some ramshackle shed. It was my carefully constructed home office, complete with electricity, proper insulation, and all the county permits displayed in a frame by the door. I'd spent 6 months building it as my work-from-home sanctuary, and it had become the most peaceful place I'd ever worked. "Good morning," she called out, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm so sorry to disturb you. I'm Rebecca Thornfield, the newly elected president of the Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I was just doing a walking tour of our lovely neighborhood to introduce myself to residents." She extended her hand in greeting, and I stepped out of the cabin to shake it, coffee mug still in my other hand. Her handshake was firm, professional, and somehow reminded me of a real estate agent closing a deal. "It's nice to meet you, Rebecca. I'm Jake Morrison. Welcome to the neighborhood. Well, I guess you're welcoming me, technically." I chuckled at my own awkwardness, but Rebecca's smile remained fixed in place. She was scanning my property with the kind of attention that made me slightly uncomfortable, like she was taking inventory for some future purpose. "This is quite a charming setup you have here," she continued, gesturing toward the cabin. "Very rustic. I can see you put a lot of work into it." "Thank you," I replied, feeling oddly defensive about the compliment. "It took me about 6 months to build, but I got all the proper permits and followed every building code to the letter. The county inspector actually used it as an example of how to do accessory structures correctly." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, still maintaining that professional smile, but I noticed her eyes had hardened slightly when I mentioned the permits. "That's wonderful that you were so thorough with the county requirements," she said, her tone still pleasant but somehow carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "Of course, as I'm sure you understand, the HOA has its own standards that sometimes go beyond what the county requires. We work very hard to maintain the aesthetic integrity and property values of Millbrook Heights." The way she emphasized aesthetic integrity made it sound like my cabin had personally offended her sense of style. That's when the mask slipped, and Rebecca's true nature began to show. "Actually, Jake, may I call you Jake? I'm afraid I have some concerns about your structure here. It's come to the attention of the board that this shed might not be in compliance with our community standards." She pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard with the dramatic flair of someone serving a subpoena. The document was titled "Violation Notice" in bold, red letters, and suddenly her friendly neighborhood tour made a lot more sense. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I read through the notice. It accused my cabin of being an unpermitted structure that detracts from the aesthetic integrity of Millbrook Heights and demanded that I remove it within 72 hours or face daily fines of $500. The language was vague and threatening, and it didn't cite any specific HOA covenants or rules. What struck me most was how prepared she'd been for this encounter. This wasn't a friendly introduction at all, but a calculated ambush. "Rebecca," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level, "this notice seems to be based on some misunderstanding. As I mentioned, I have all the proper county permits for this structure. Could you show me exactly which HOA covenant this allegedly violates?" Her smile finally disappeared entirely, replaced by the cold expression of someone who wasn't used to being questioned. "The HOA has broad authority to maintain community standards, Jake. The specific covenants are available for your review, but the bottom line is that this structure needs to go." "I see," I replied, feeling the first stirrings of what would become a very deep anger. Rebecca had come into my backyard, smiled to my face, and then tried to destroy something I'd built with my own hands, based on nothing more than her personal opinion. "Well, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I'll need some time to review the relevant documents and consult with my own attorney before I make any decisions about my legally permitted structure." Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly, and I could see that my calm response wasn't what she'd expected. She'd probably anticipated that I would either cave immediately to her authority or get angry enough to make myself look unreasonable. Instead, I was treating her like exactly what she was, someone making legal threats without proper justification. "Jake, I hope you understand that this isn't personal. I'm simply trying to preserve the character of our community. You have 72 hours to comply, or the fines will begin accumulating immediately." As she clicked back toward the street in those sensible heels, I stood there holding her violation notice and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. The cold, calculated fury of someone who'd been underestimated by the wrong person. Rebecca Thornfield had just made the critical error of assuming I was another pushover neighbor who would fold under pressure. What she didn't know was that I specialized in solving complex problems, and she had just become my most interesting puzzle yet. 72 hours, I muttered to myself, watching her expensive Mercedes disappear around the corner. This is going to be fun. That evening, I did what any good engineer would do when faced with a problem. I gathered data. I spread out all my HOA documents on my kitchen table and began reading through every single page of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed our little slice of suburban paradise. What I found was fascinating, and not in a good way for Rebecca. The original HOA documents were surprisingly reasonable and mostly focused on basic maintenance standards, but there had been several recent amendments that were much more restrictive and vaguely worded. Interestingly, most of these changes had been pushed through in the past 6 months, right around the time Rebecca had moved in and somehow gotten herself elected as HOA president. I also discovered that Rebecca's election had been a special vote held after the previous president had suddenly resigned, and she'd won by only 3 votes out of 37 cast. The amendments talked about maintaining community aesthetics and preserving property values, but they were written in such broad language that they could theoretically be used to ban almost anything. The next morning, I made calls to the county planning office and confirmed what I already knew. My cabin was completely legal according to all local zoning laws and building codes. The permits I'd obtained weren't just rubber stamps. They'd required detailed architectural drawings, engineering specifications, and multiple inspections. The county had actually praised the quality of the construction and used photos of my cabin as an example in their permitting guidebook. Around noon on Wednesday, Rebecca returned, but this time she wasn't alone. She'd brought along a thin, tired-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who introduced himself as Marcus Webb, the HOA's attorney. Behind them were 3 neighbors, Mrs. Patterson from next door, who gave me an apologetic shrug, and Tim and Sarah Chen from down the street, who looked like they'd been dragged there against their will. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said in the weary tone of a man who'd handled too many HOA disputes, "I'm here to inform you that the board is prepared to take legal action if you don't comply with the violation notice." I invited them all onto my porch, where I'd laid out copies of all my permits, county approvals, and building inspections. "Marcus, I appreciate you coming out here, but I think there might be some confusion about what constitutes a violation. Everything you see here is completely legal and properly permitted." I walked him through each document, pointing out the county stamp of approval, the inspection signatures, and the zoning compliance certificates. Marcus studied the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who knew he was walking into a potential legal minefield. "This is all very thorough," Marcus admitted, glancing nervously at Rebecca, who was standing behind him with her arms crossed and her foot tapping impatiently. "But the HOA still has covenants that govern architectural consistency within the community." That's when I mentioned the Denver case, where a court had ruled that HOA covenants cannot supersede county zoning laws for permitted structures. Marcus's face went pale, and he looked at Rebecca with what I could only describe as barely concealed irritation. "Perhaps we should reconsider our approach here, Rebecca," Marcus said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "These permits appear to be legitimate, and frankly, I'm not comfortable proceeding without a much stronger legal foundation." It was clear that Marcus knew Rebecca was overplaying her hand, and he was trying to give her an exit ramp before she drove them both off a cliff. But Rebecca wasn't having it. Her face was getting redder by the minute, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure in front of the neighbors. "This is ridiculous," she finally exploded. "We're trying to maintain standards here, and you're being completely unreasonable, Jake. Do you want this neighborhood to turn into some kind of trailer park?" That's when Mrs. Patterson, bless her heart, spoke up. "Actually, Rebecca, I think Jake's cabin is quite lovely. It's certainly nicer than that rusty shed the Johnsons have behind their house." Tim Chen nodded in agreement, finding his voice for the first time. "Rebecca, with all due respect, I think you might be overreacting here. Jake's structure looks professional and well built. Maybe we should focus on actual problems in the neighborhood instead of creating new ones." I could see Rebecca realizing that her support wasn't as solid as she'd thought, and her desperation was starting to show. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably and made one more attempt to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we should table this discussion and reconvene when everyone's had a chance to review the relevant statutes more thoroughly." But Rebecca's pride wouldn't let her back down in front of the neighbors. "No," she said firmly, her voice shaking slightly. "The deadline stands. 72 hours, or we're filing a lawsuit and imposing daily fines." As they walked away, I noticed Marcus hanging back and shaking his head slightly. He caught my eye and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," before hurrying to catch up with Rebecca, who was storming toward her car like a woman possessed. Tim and Sarah Chen lingered on my porch for a moment, and Tim spoke quietly. "Jake, for what it's worth, I think Rebecca's lost her mind over this. Most of us think your cabin is actually pretty cool." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just defending my cabin, I was going to go on the offense. If Rebecca wanted to play hardball, I'd show her what a real power play looked like. I picked up my phone and called Tom Chin, a private investigator I'd known since college. "Tom," I said when he answered, "I need you to run a background check on someone. Her name is Rebecca Thornfield, and I have a feeling there's more to her story than she's letting on." Tom Chen was the kind of private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud and financial crimes. He'd left the Denver Police Department 5 years earlier to start his own firm, and he had a reputation for uncovering things that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. When I explained the situation with Rebecca and the HOA, Tom got that interested tone in his voice that told me he smelled something fishy. "Give me until tomorrow morning," Tom said. "I'll run a full background check and see what kind of digital footprint she's left behind. If she's playing games with the HOA, there'll be evidence somewhere." While Tom worked his magic, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. I spent Thursday morning walking around the neighborhood, really looking at the houses and properties for the first time since I'd moved in. What I saw was eye-opening. Rebecca's house, the massive colonial directly across from mine, had several modifications that I was pretty sure hadn't been there when the original owners lived there. There was a new deck on the back, an extended driveway, and what looked like a completely renovated landscaping setup with professional-grade lighting and irrigation systems. That afternoon, I decided to take a closer look at the HOA meeting minutes, which were supposed to be available to all homeowners. What I found in the records was fascinating. Rebecca had been elected HOA president in a special election held just 4 months ago, after the previous president had suddenly resigned. But more interesting were the decisions she'd made since taking office. In her short tenure, Rebecca had approved several emergency contracts with various service providers, including an exclusive landscaping contract with something called Greenfield Corporation. The phone rang at exactly 6 p.m. "Jake," Tom said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "You're not going to believe what I found. This isn't just about power, it's about money, big money." My heart started racing as Tom laid out what he'd discovered. The invoice for Greenfield Corporation led nowhere. The landscaping company listed didn't exist in any state database. The P.O. box tied to it? Fake. Tom had reached out to the supposed CEO, who responded from a Gmail account and panicked when Tom mentioned HOA regulations. Scam. Plain and simple. "But here's where it gets really interesting," Tom continued. "I traced the bank account where all those HOA payments are going. Guess who's the primary signatory? Rebecca Thornfield. She's not just stealing from your neighbors. She's created an entire fake company to do it." I felt my jaw drop as the implications sank in. Every homeowner in Millbrook Heights had been forced to pay inflated prices to a company that didn't actually exist, with all the money flowing directly into Rebecca's personal accounts. "It gets better," Tom said, clearly enjoying himself now. "I pulled the permits for her house modifications, and guess what? Half of them were never filed with the county. That deck you mentioned? No permit. The driveway extension? No permit. She's been using stolen HOA money to fund illegal home improvements while threatening you for having a completely legal structure." But Tom wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's one more thing that's really interesting. I did some digging into her finances, and Rebecca is leveraged up to her eyeballs. She borrowed against her house to start this scam, and she's been struggling to make her mortgage payments. Without that fake Greenfield income stream, she's in serious financial trouble." That evening, as I sat in my cabin reviewing all the evidence Tom had gathered, my phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. The tone was completely different from her earlier confrontations. Sweet, almost apologetic. "Hi, Jake. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I wonder if we might find a compromise. If you're willing to consider relocating your cabin to a less visible part of your property, I might be able to help restructure some of the HOA requirements. Would you be open to discussing this over coffee tomorrow?" I stared at the message for a long moment, recognizing it for what it was. A desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from her. Rebecca had probably spent the day realizing that her legal threats weren't going to work, and now she was trying the honey instead of vinegar approach. It was actually kind of pathetic, and it confirmed what Tom had discovered about her financial desperation and criminal activity. I typed back a simple response. Rebecca, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not moving my legally permitted structure anywhere. However, I think we do need to have a much longer conversation about violations and permits. How about we chat tomorrow morning? I hit send and then immediately called Tom back. I need you to document everything you found and get me physical copies of all the evidence. Tomorrow is going to be very interesting. Within an hour, I had a folder full of evidence that would make Rebecca's violation notice look like a joke. Bank records showing stolen HOA funds, property records showing unpermitted modifications, and documentation proving that Greenfield Corporation was nothing more than an elaborate theft scheme. But I still wasn't ready to play my hand completely. I wanted to see how far Rebecca would go with her desperation before I brought out the heavy artillery. Rebecca's response came quickly. Of course, Jake. I'm always willing to work with reasonable neighbors. What time works for you? I could practically hear the forced cheerfulness in her text, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered that she'd been systematically stealing from every family in our neighborhood while threatening to destroy my property, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated instantly. How about 8 a.m., I replied. We can meet in my backyard. I'll be in my cabin enjoying my morning coffee. Let her come to me, I thought. Let her see exactly what she was trying to destroy, and let her squirm while she tried to pretend that this was all just a misunderstanding. Tomorrow morning, Rebecca Thornfield was going to learn what it felt like to be completely outmaneuvered by someone who'd done his homework and discovered her crimes. Friday morning arrived with all the drama I'd been expecting, but Rebecca's approach was completely different from what I'd anticipated. Instead of showing up with demolition crews and legal threats, she arrived alone at exactly 8 a.m., carrying 2 cups of coffee from the expensive cafe downtown and wearing what I could only describe as a repentant neighbor outfit. Casual jeans and a soft sweater instead of her usual power blazer. Good morning, Jake, she called out with a smile that looked genuinely warm for the first time since I'd met her. I brought coffee as a peace offering. I realize I may have come on a little too strong the other day, and I'd like to start over, if that's possible. She extended one of the cups toward me, and I had to admit that her transformation was impressive. If I didn't know what I knew about her fake company and systematic theft from our neighbors, I might have actually believed she was sincere. I accepted the coffee but didn't invite her into the cabin. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe and waited to see how she planned to play this. I appreciate the gesture, Rebecca. What did you want to discuss? She took a sip of her coffee and looked around my backyard like she was seeing it for the first time. You know, Jake, I've been thinking about what you said regarding your permits and county approvals. I may have been too hasty in my assessment of your cabin. Rebecca nodded earnestly, launching into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed speech about community cooperation and finding mutually beneficial solutions. She suggested that maybe the cabin could stay if I agreed to some minor aesthetic modifications, like painting it a different color or adding some landscaping around the base. That's when she made her first real mistake. In fact, Rebecca continued, I'd be happy to have Greenfield Corporation provide the landscaping services at a significant discount. Consider it my way of making amends for our rocky start. The irony was delicious. She was literally trying to use her fake company to solve the problem she'd created, probably hoping to salvage at least some income from her scam. I set down my coffee cup and looked directly into her eyes. Rebecca, that's a very generous offer, but I have to ask, does Greenfield Corporation actually exist? The question hit her like a physical blow. Her face went pale and she nearly dropped her coffee cup. For a moment, the mask slipped completely and I saw naked panic in her eyes before she managed to compose herself. That's not really relevant to our discussion about your cabin, she stammered, but her voice had lost all its earlier warmth. Actually, I think it's very relevant, I replied calmly. That's when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, and we both turned to see what looked like half the neighborhood walking into my backyard. Mrs. Patterson led the charge, followed by Tim and Sarah Chen, David Martinez, Carol Williams, and about 6 other neighbors I recognized from around the community. Morning, Jake, called out Mrs. Patterson cheerfully. We thought you might want some moral support today. Tim Chen stepped forward with more confidence than I'd ever seen from him. Rebecca, we've been talking as a community, and frankly, we don't want to witness a neighbor being forced to destroy his legal property based on made-up rules. But it was what happened next that turned everything upside down. Carol Williams, the retired teacher, cleared her throat and addressed the group. Actually, there's something I think everyone needs to know about our HOA finances. She looked directly at Rebecca, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. I volunteered to help with the books a few months ago, thinking I could contribute to the community. Rebecca told me my services weren't needed. The crowd listened intently as Carol continued. The next week, my mailbox was mysteriously smashed, and I received 3 separate code violations in 24 hours. For things like having the wrong shade of white paint on my shutters and leaving my garbage can visible from the street for 6 minutes after pickup. A murmur of anger rippled through the gathered neighbors. That's when I started paying attention to where our HOA money was really going. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the tension. Carol, are you saying Rebecca retaliated against you for asking questions? Carol nodded grimly. I'm saying that when I tried to verify some of the invoices, I discovered some very interesting things about our landscaping contractor. The crowd turned to look at Rebecca, who was now visibly shaking. Greenfield Corporation doesn't exist in any state business registry, I checked. The reaction was immediate and explosive. They made me rip up my native garden. They fined me for having a bird path. My dues tripled overnight. The stories poured out like water from a burst pipe. Petty rules, surprise inspections, threats of foreclosure. An HOA designed to preserve community had turned predatory, and now everyone was beginning to understand why. David Martinez, the retired police officer, stepped forward with the calm authority of someone used to dealing with criminals. Rebecca, what Carol is describing sounds like fraud. Are you stealing from this community? Rebecca's response was to get defensive rather than explanatory, which was exactly the wrong move. My business dealings are completely separate from my HOA duties, she insisted, but her voice was cracking now. That's when I decided it was time to reveal what Tom had discovered. Since everyone's here, I announced, maybe this is a good time to discuss some interesting discoveries I've made. I pulled out the folder Tom had prepared and began distributing copies of the bank records, showing HOA funds flowing into Rebecca's personal accounts. Rebecca has been stealing from every family in this neighborhood through a fake landscaping company. The crowd erupted in angry voices as neighbors compared notes about their inflated bills and forced compliance with Rebecca's non-existent contractor. Tim Chen's voice rose above the others. Rebecca, you've been robbing us blind while threatening to destroy Jake's legal cabin? Mrs. Patterson's normally gentle voice was shaking with rage. How much money have you stolen from us? In desperation, Rebecca tried to regain control by returning to her original threat, but her voice was breaking with panic. None of this changes the fact that Jake's structure violates community standards. That's when every single neighbor in my backyard turned to look at her with expressions of complete disgust. Carol Williams spoke for everyone when she said, Rebecca, you're a thief and a bully. You need to resign immediately and return every penny you've stolen. But Rebecca wasn't finished yet. In a final act of desperation, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 with visibly shaking hands. I need police assistance, she said, her voice breaking. There's a man in violation of community standards who's refusing to comply with HOA regulations. The audacity was breathtaking. She was calling the police while surrounded by neighbors who now knew she was a criminal. When the patrol officers arrived, they immediately understood the situation. After reviewing my permits and the evidence of Rebecca's theft, the senior officer looked at her with disgust. Ma'am, not only is this gentleman's structure completely legal, but based on what I'm seeing here, you've got much bigger problems than HOA violations. As they prepared to leave, one officer quietly mentioned that someone might want to contact the district attorney's office about potential fraud charges. The 72-hour deadline had come and gone. My cabin was still standing, and Rebecca Thornfield's criminal empire was crumbling around her. As the neighbors began planning their next steps to recover their stolen money, Rebecca stood alone in my backyard, her coffee growing cold and her reign of terror finally over. That Friday evening, I was grilling burgers on my back porch when Mrs. Patterson came over with a troubled expression. Jake, she said, I just got a call from Rebecca. She's calling an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. She says it's to vote on your continued membership in the community. I nearly choked on my beer. Rebecca was actually trying to get me kicked out of the neighborhood entirely, a move that was both legally questionable and politically suicidal. Did she say anything else? I asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. She claimed you were a disruptive influence who was threatening the harmony and property values of Millbrook Heights. She's demanding that the board vote to revoke your membership and force you to sell your house. The audacity was breathtaking. Rebecca was so desperate to get rid of my cabin that she was willing to try to force me out of my own home. Saturday was spent preparing for what I knew would be the final showdown. I organized all my evidence into a presentation that would systematically dismantle Rebecca's credibility and expose her corruption. I had the unpermitted modifications to her house, the conflict of interest with Greenfield Corporation, the inflated contracts that were costing every homeowner in the neighborhood thousands of dollars annually, and several other gems that Tom had uncovered in his investigation. The emergency meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building that usually hosted children's birthday parties and senior citizen bingo games. By 7 p.m., it was packed with nearly every adult resident of Millbrook Heights. Rebecca had clearly been working the phones, because the energy in the room was electric with anticipation. She'd positioned herself at the front of the room behind a folding table, like she was presiding over a tribunal. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who knew she was in over her head but was committed to the bluff. "We're here tonight because of a serious threat to our community standards and property values. Jake Morrison has repeatedly refused to comply with HOA regulations, and his defiant attitude is setting a dangerous precedent for other homeowners." She went on like this for about 10 minutes, painting me as some kind of neighborhood anarchist who was single-handedly destroying the suburban dream. It was actually quite impressive in its complete disconnection from reality. When she finished her opening statement, she looked directly at me with a smug smile. "Mr. Morrison, you have 5 minutes to explain why we shouldn't vote to terminate your membership in this community." I stood up slowly, carrying my folder of evidence, and walked to the front of the room. The silence was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop. "Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate the opportunity to address everyone tonight, but before I explain why I belong in this community, I think we need to talk about why you don't." I opened my folder and pulled out the first set of photographs. These are pictures of unpermitted modifications to Rebecca's house, modifications that violate county building codes and state law. I passed the photos around the room, watching as neighbors studied them and began whispering to each other. Rebecca tried to interrupt, but I continued calmly. "But the building code violations are just the beginning. Rebecca, would you like to tell everyone about your ownership stake in Greenfield Corporation?" The room went dead silent again. Rebecca's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. "That's irrelevant," she managed to stammer. "This meeting is about your violations, not my business interests." I smiled and pulled out the next set of documents. "Actually, it's completely relevant. See, everyone in this room has been forced to pay inflated prices to Greenfield Corporation because Rebecca, as HOA president, gave them an exclusive contract. What she didn't disclose is that she owns 51% of the company." The murmuring in the room was getting louder, and I could see several neighbors pulling out their calculators to figure out how much extra they'd been paying. Tim Chen stood up from the back of the room. "Rebecca, is this true? Do you own part of Greenfield?" Rebecca's response was to get defensive rather than explanatory. "My business interests are none of your concern. This meeting is about Jake's illegal structure." That's when Sarah Chen joined her husband. "Actually, Rebecca, it is our concern. We've been wondering why we can't get quotes from other landscaping companies. Now we know you've been forcing us to pay your company's inflated prices." The room was starting to buzz with angry conversations as neighbors compared notes about their landscaping bills. I decided it was time to bring out the heavy artillery. "There's more," I announced, pulling out the financial documents Tom had uncovered. "Rebecca has been using HOA funds to pay for legal fees related to her personal business interests. The money she's spending to harass me about my legal cabin, that's coming out of everyone's HOA dues. That got their attention. Nothing motivates homeowners quite like the discovery that their money is being wasted on someone else's personal vendettas." Marcus Webb, who had been sitting quietly in the corner looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally stood up. "Rebecca, I think we need to adjourn this meeting and discuss these allegations privately." But the other board members were having none of it. Board member Patricia Reynolds, a retired teacher who'd been quiet throughout Rebecca's presidency, spoke up for the first time. "Actually, Marcus, I think we need to address this right now. If these allegations are true, Rebecca needs to resign immediately." The meeting devolved into chaos as neighbors demanded answers. Board members called for Rebecca's resignation, and Rebecca herself seemed to realize that her carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing around her. In desperation, she played her final card. "Fine," she screamed over the noise. "If you won't support me, I'll make sure this entire neighborhood suffers. I'll tie everyone up in lawsuits until your property values crater and you're all begging me to come back." The room went silent at this threat, and I could see that Rebecca had finally revealed her true nature to everyone present. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her voice shaking with anger. "Rebecca Thornfield, you are a disgrace to this community and to the office you hold. I move that we vote immediately to remove you as HOA president." The motion was seconded instantly by at least 5 other people, and within minutes the vote was called. The result was unanimous. Rebecca was out and her reign of terror was over. 3 days after the emergency meeting, Rebecca received a registered letter that would change everything. I know this because I was the one who sent it, and I'd been planning this move since the moment Tom had finished his background investigation. You see, while Rebecca had been focused on my cabin and her landscaping scam, I'd been working on something much bigger, something that would give me complete control over the situation. The letter informed Rebecca that her mortgage had been purchased by Morrison Financial Holdings, which was actually just me, operating under a business name I'd registered years earlier for freelance consulting work. What Rebecca didn't know was that her financial situation was far more precarious than she'd let on. She'd leveraged her house to the hilt to buy into Greenfield Corporation, and she'd been struggling to make her mortgage payments even with the inflated HOA contracts. When the original lender had decided to sell off some of their riskier loans, I'd been ready. My day job as a senior software engineer at a fintech company had given me connections in the distressed debt market, and I'd quietly purchased Rebecca's mortgage for 60 cents on the dollar. Legally, I now owned her debt, which meant I had the right to call it due immediately or begin foreclosure proceedings. The phone call came within an hour of her receiving the letter. "What the hell is this?" Rebecca screamed into the phone, all pretense of civility finally abandoned. "You can't just buy someone's mortgage." I chuckled softly. "Actually, Rebecca, mortgages are bought and sold every day. It's a perfectly legal business transaction. And according to the terms of your loan, which you signed, the debt can be called due immediately if the new holder has concerns about your ability to pay." "You're bluffing," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Am I? Let me ask you something, Rebecca. How have you been making your mortgage payments these past few months? Because according to my calculations, your salary from whatever job you actually have, combined with your share of Greenfield's profits, shouldn't be enough to cover your monthly expenses." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca had been using the inflated HOA contracts to keep herself afloat financially. Without that guaranteed income stream, she was in serious trouble. "Here's how this is going to work," I continued calmly. "You have two choices. Option 1, I call the loan due immediately, you can't pay it, and I foreclose on your house. You lose everything and your credit is destroyed for the next 7 years. "What's option 2? She asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Option 2 is that you accept my generous offer to become my tenant. I'll restructure your debt as a rental agreement, and you can stay in your house for the low price of 3 times your current mortgage payment." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. 3 times her mortgage payment would be about $4,500 a month, money she definitely didn't have. "You can't do this," she protested weakly. "This is extortion." I laughed out loud at that. "Rebecca, this is capitalism. You took a financial risk when you leveraged your house to buy into a business, and now that risk is catching up with you. I'm actually being quite generous. Most investors would just foreclose and be done with it." "I need time to think about this," she said. "Of course," I replied cheerfully. "You have 72 hours to decide. If I don't hear from you by Monday morning, I'll assume you've chosen option 1, and I'll begin foreclosure proceedings." The irony was delicious. I was giving her the same 72-hour deadline she'd tried to impose on me. That weekend, I watched from my cabin as Rebecca paced around her backyard, talking frantically on her phone. She was clearly trying to find alternative financing or someone to buy her out of her predicament. But Tom's investigation had been thorough. Rebecca had already exhausted most of her options before I'd entered the picture. She'd borrowed against her retirement accounts, maxed out her credit cards, and even taken a second mortgage to fund her Greenfield investment. Monday morning arrived right on schedule, and so did Rebecca's phone call. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she asked, her voice flat with defeat. "Rebecca, you always have choices. You chose to leverage your house for a risky business venture. You chose to abuse your position as HOA president to funnel money to your own company. You chose to try to destroy my property over a personal vendetta. These are all consequences of choices you made." "Fine," she said through what sounded like gritted teeth. "I'll take option 2, but I want a written agreement that spells out exactly what you expect." Within a week, Rebecca Thornfield had gone from being the tyrannical HOA president who was going to force me to tear down my cabin to being my tenant, paying me $4,500 a month to live in a house I now effectively owned. The woman who'd given me 72 hours to comply with her demands was now living under terms I'd dictated to her. 6 months later, I was sitting in my cabin on a crisp October morning, watching the sunrise and reflecting on how dramatically things had changed in Millbrook Heights. The coffee tasted better somehow, knowing that every month Rebecca wrote me a check for $4,500. Money that was slowly paying down the mortgage I now held on her house. The irony never got old. The transformation of our little community had been remarkable. After Rebecca's ouster as HOA president, the board had elected Mrs. Patterson as interim president, and she'd immediately set about undoing the damage. The exclusive contract with Greenfield Corporation was terminated, and homeowners were once again free to choose their own landscaping services. The average cost of yard maintenance dropped by about 40% almost overnight. Rebecca herself had become something of a ghost in the neighborhood. She'd taken a second job, waitressing at a chain restaurant to help cover her new rental payments, and her expensive Mercedes had been replaced by a 10-year-old Honda Civic. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by the practical uniforms of someone working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She kept her head down and avoided eye contact with neighbors who had once deferred to her authority. My cabin, meanwhile, had become something of a neighborhood landmark. The new HOA board had officially recognized it as a positive addition to the community, and several other homeowners had asked for my advice on building their own backyard offices. I'd even started a small side business helping neighbors navigate the permitting process for home improvements. Business that, ironically, sometimes included correcting the unpermitted work Rebecca had done on her own house. The legal aftermath had been surprisingly minimal. Once Rebecca's corruption was exposed, Marcus Webb had quickly distanced himself and the HOA from any further legal action against me. The threatened lawsuit never materialized, and the daily fines Rebecca had imposed were officially rescinded. In fact, the new board had issued me a formal apology and a letter commending my patience and professionalism in the face of harassment. Tom Chen's investigation had also uncovered some interesting details about Greenfield Corporation's other contracts. It turned out that Rebecca had been running similar scams in 2 other neighborhoods, using her partnership in the company to secure exclusive contracts through various front organizations. When those communities learned about the conflict of interest, they terminated their contracts as well, leaving Greenfield struggling to stay afloat. The most satisfying part of the whole saga was watching how the community had rallied together once the truth came out. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up during Rebecca's reign of terror were now actively participating in HOA meetings and holding board members accountable. Property values had actually increased after the landscaping costs dropped, and the community became more cohesive. My favorite moment came about 4 months after Rebecca's downfall, when I was working in my cabin and heard a knock on the door. It was a woman named Jennifer Martinez from a neighboring community called Oakwood Estates. "Mr. Morrison," she said nervously, "I heard about what happened with your HOA president, and I'm hoping you might be able to help us. Our board is trying to force several homeowners to remove perfectly legal structures from their properties, and we think there might be some financial impropriety involved." I invited Jennifer in for coffee and listened to her story, which sounded remarkably familiar. Another self-appointed neighborhood dictator was abusing their power for personal gain, and another group of homeowners was being bullied into compliance. "Jennifer," I said with a smile, "I think I can definitely help you out. But first, let me ask you something. Does your HOA president happen to have any business relationships with the companies they're forcing you to use?" The conversation that followed led to another investigation, another exposure of corruption, and another satisfying resolution where justice prevailed over abuse of power. Word began to spread through the region about the software engineer who specialized in taking down corrupt HOA officials, and I found myself consulting on cases throughout Colorado and beyond. As I finish writing this story, I'm looking out the window of my cabin at Rebecca's house across the street. She's in her Honda Civic, heading off to one of her jobs, while I'm sipping coffee in the structure she once demanded I tear down. In exactly 18 more months, she'll have paid off enough of her inflated rent to cover the original mortgage balance, at which point I'll own her house outright. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Rebecca, if maybe I went too far in my revenge. But then I remember the arrogance in her voice when she gave me 72 hours to destroy something I'd built with my own hands. The way she abused her power to line her own pockets, and the fear she instilled in neighbors who just wanted to live in peace. Rebecca Thornfield created her own downfall through greed, corruption, and the belief that she could bully people into submission. The best part about justice, I've learned, is that it doesn't have to be loud or dramatic to be effective. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply letting someone's own actions catch up with them while you sit back and collect the rent. And speaking of collecting rent, I should probably go check the mail. Rebecca's monthly payment should be arriving any day now.